Dr. Evans, let's just start on the ground floor, just really basic. What is anxiety?
Good question. So first of all, anxiety is something that, well, I'm preaching to the choir, so to speak. Your congregation has been hearing about this, but it's something that everyone experiences. One definition we could give it is a feeling of worry or nervousness or dis-ease in anticipation of something, or when experiencing uncertainty. We're uncertain of what an outcome will be. So occasional anxiety is just a part of life. It's what you experience before taking a test, or when having a problem at work, or when going out on the road and you realize a car is coming. That it's a typical experience. But there is something called anxiety disorders, where this is more than just that temporary worry or fear. A person who has an anxiety disorder, it will persist and it could get worse over time. And these symptoms will start to interfere with daily activities such as job or school performance or relationships. So there are different kinds of anxiety disorders, but what's unique is that when you have an anxiety disorder, you have this persistent, excessive fear or worry, even when there's nothing threatening. So it all of a sudden doesn't make sense. It's like a car alarm going off without anyone around it, or the smoke alarm going off and there is no smoke. I'm feeling anxious and I don't even have a reason. I don't know why. It happens on a physiological level, where maybe the heart is racing, or you're feeling tightness in your chest, shortness of breath, maybe sweating, headaches, stomach aches, all kinds of physiological reactions. And it also impacts emotionally, where maybe you're feeling tense, indecisive, restless, irritable, can't think straight, feeling apprehensive. And what's going on with that, why that's happening, is because literally something's going on in our brain. God designed us with these brains to be able to withstand threat and stress. So we have this stress response system that when there is a threat of danger, our body kicks into gear. We have this built-in alarm system. The part of our brain, it's called the amygdala, and it is this built-in alarm system that hijacks the prefrontal cortex. And when it does that, it sends into gear different hormones and different bodily responses, like I just described. Increased heart rate, you're more aroused or alert, all for the purpose of responding to that threat through fight, flight, or freeze. Fighting through the threat, freezing up, or running away from the threat. It does this so that we can respond when there is danger, when there is threat. Now, when you have an anxiety disorder, as I said, that's going off at the wrong times, or it's disproportionate to the situation. And if that happens, that, if we are getting kind of pumped with anxiety over a period of time, it wears and tears. It creates physical conditions, medical conditions. It can really take a toll on the body.
Yeah. Well, given where we are now with pandemic, and just kind of fear is just circulating, it seems, does that mean that our response system is overacting for too long?
I would absolutely say that that's happening on an individual and a collective level. We have faced a real and an ongoing threat with this pandemic. And the challenge of that threat is that we're heightened and we're aroused, but we don't really see when the end is in sight. And so that's really not sustainable to stay in that kind of heightened place for too long. Also, what happens, when I said that the amygdala hijacks the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex is what we need to make decisions, to be able to organize our schedules, to use good judgment. So we're in survival mode. And I would say, as individuals and as a family and as society, we've been in survival mode, even on a physiological level, where we've been aroused, we're alert, we're facing danger. Now this may ebb and flow, may come down and go up again, but it is taking a toll on us individually and collectively. Something else I can add to that is that this alarm and this threat, this anxiety, we could say even is contagious. So an example of that might be when you go to the grocery store and you see people with masks and with gloves, and you have people checking you when you walk in the door, and you have people making sure you're 6 feet apart when you're waiting in line to pay for your food, and you have one-way aisles in the grocery store. Like, I mean, you better have an organized system, because if you forgot one thing, you're going to be, it's stressful.
Yeah.
And there's something about that alarm. I remember when this first started, and, you know, there was the frantic of the frenzy of getting the toilet paper. And when you look around and you see people with gloves, masks, overflowing carts, what happens? It's alarming. It can do something in me. I might even question if I'm not as alarmed. If I'm not alarmed, I'm asking, should I be alarmed?
Right.
It's contagious. This anxiety has also been contagious. And it's because there's a real threat. We may not see it, but we know it exists. We know it's there.
Right. It's so interesting, the collective side of it. You know, something I've been hearing throughout this whole thing is just realizing how interconnected we are as humans. You know, as much as we like to think that we are self-sufficient, we're really so dependent. And it's so interesting to hear that we're dependent on each other, even just mentally, mental health. I like what you said, when you see other people that are going to such great lengths of caution, you begin to like, well, is there something wrong with me? Why am I not doing what everyone else around me is doing, and stockpiling? And it's just so interesting to hear that collective sense.
It's absolute. To me, that is an example of how we are wired. We are created for connection with each other, and how we feed off of each other. And during this time, we can really evaluate it. What is it that I'm kind of giving off because other people are feeding off of that? Are we kind of encouraging the frenzy and the anxiety, and how are we responding to that? When we, as I said, if we're heightened, we might respond in these survival ways, but are we helping or hurting others in the process of responding out of our own alarm and our own panic?
That's really good. That's really good. So I guess for those who are listening, who maybe find themselves wrestling through these anxious feelings, and I know for some people that may have wrestled with anxiety before all of this, and now it's almost like it's heightened, but even those who, you know, have maybe never really had heightened sense of anxiety in them, but now all of a sudden there are these foreign feelings. What are some healthy and unhealthy coping mechanisms that can help us as we evaluate what's going on with us?
Sure. Well, I mean, one of the things I really had to challenge myself with at the beginning of this, and try to have this be a way of thinking about this, and my encouragement to others is, you know, there is an attitude of sobriety and caution that is really wise to have, has been recommended and mandated. And we have this responsibility to respond to our government leaders and to each other. And this has been an exercise. I'll speak specifically for American culture. I think this has been an exercise to learn how to actually sacrifice on behalf of each other in a way that we're not typically in tune with, because of our entitlement and our independent nature, our individualistic rights. So my point is that we have this responsibility to be sober about this, but we do not have a responsibility to be fearful about this. I think that there is a way that we can be cautious without being fearful. We can be vigilant without panic. We can consider how we can be responsible without contributing to the frenzy. So first and foremost, I would just encourage everyone to know they're not alone. And sometimes just naming emotion and talking about it in and of itself is helpful. Beyond anxiety, we are going through corporate loss right now, multiple layers of loss that need to be talked about, named, and grieved. We're going through a form of trauma, which is when there is a threat and we respond with powerlessness and fear. These are real things. So naming them in and of themselves can be helpful, and finding ways to express ourselves through lament, through laughter, through crying. The next thing I would say is we have to look at what feeds our fears. I have this little like sign that says, please do not feed the fears. It's like, it looks like it's supposed to be, please do not feed the bears, but it says, please do not feed the fears. And I think it's really helpful to think about, what is it for me personally that feeds my fears? If it's, the news, do I have to watch the news every day? Or do I have to watch it all day, every day? I can change the notifications on my phone. Maybe I'm not going to watch the news at all, and I will have a family member be the one to relay the need to know information. Maybe being on Facebook feeds my fears or feeds my anxiety when I see what other people are accomplishing and I feel like I'm not accomplishing that. So we have to look at what feeds our fears. That's something within our control. That is something that we can manage. The next thing I will say that's absolutely important is helping our bodies physiologically. If we're in that aroused state, we need to do things that will help calm our bodies down. Movement and exercise, thankfully, that has not been taken from us, is one of those things that can really help clear our mind and help calm our bodies down and bring them back to a better place. And finally, we can help our minds by trying to focus and reframe our thoughts on what is helpful, true, and productive. And that's what you all have been studying. Philippians 4, 6-8, right there. It's talking to us about how we have prayer and what we can choose to think on. One of the greatest things we can do sometimes is just distract ourselves from our fears through something funny, through doing something together as a family, or watching a funny movie or a YouTube video. Music is a great way to infuse our mind with truth or something beautiful that is the opposite of the unmanageability and the chaos and the stress that we're really immersed in right now.
It's interesting. At the beginning, you had mentioned the idea of loss.
Yes.
And you had sent us over an article that you had written. And by the way, for everyone watching, we did make that available for you as well. So if you go to lhtchurch.tv and click on our COVID response, we have a link to Dr. Evans's article, and you should read it. It's really incredible. But one of the things I found fascinating was what you just mentioned about the idea of loss. And I didn't think about it like this. Like, even for myself, I had a trip plan that got canceled. I never thought about it in terms of a loss that would have to be grieved. My mom was supposed to come for Mother's Day up from North Carolina, and the plans were canceled. But I just think about, even for some of those watching who have children who are in school, and school has been taken away from them, and their friends have been taken away from them. How do our parents recognize loss in their kids that we may not think about as anxiety or trauma, but really the separation from school or kids? Does that make sense? Am I on the right track?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I think with children, first of all, they're taking cues from us and how to respond to all of this. And that's complicated. I mean, children by nature, as they're developing and they're interpreting and they're making meaning of their experiences. And we as adults, we don't even have a place in our brain to understand what's happening right now. So it's really difficult to navigate that and to know how to help our children. But they are taking cues from us. So that first and foremost is something to keep in mind on limiting what conversations or what news, what intake they're having. But in terms of your question about loss, I think too easily we might interpret their forms of grief as misbehavior or as complaining. Now, I'm not saying that children should not be redirected, but I think if we can help redirect that for them and name it, that maybe what they're experiencing is loss. They're sad that they cannot play with their friends. They're struggling to understand why they can't go back to school and see their teacher one more time or see their classmates one more time. I mean, it's part of our nature to have things to look forward to. And parents and teachers are like rock stars right now, doing amazing things, trying to keep their kids having things to look forward to and things to do during the day. But I would say validating their feelings, giving them space to have feelings, finding creative ways for them to talk about what they're really sad and disappointed and even frustrated with, being able to say, I know this is really hard. And I know we don't know how long this is going to go, and you're doing great. And then helping redirect them with something that they can manage. Can they make a call with their friends? Can they write a note or a letter to someone? How can they manage and be productive or do something creative in the midst of what we cannot manage and cannot do anything about?
I love that idea of naming it for them, because I think even as adults, we need our friends and we need our community to oftentimes name stuff for us.
Yes.
And in this season, our small groups have moved to Zoom meetings, and we're trying to encourage this idea of community, of staying connected with each other, because there's often it's in community that other people can see what you can't see and can help name what you're going through and redirect it. So I really think that's powerful. What I'm wondering is, for us watching, is there any kind of daily practice that we can check in with ourselves? Almost like a daily, how am I doing? Where are my thoughts? Like that kind of test. Is there anything we can do?
Yeah, well, you just had a good idea right there. I think even taking time to ask those questions. How am I doing? What am I thinking about? What am I feeling? And whatever works for us. If maybe some of us are journaling people, we can journal. Maybe some of us are talking people. Who could we check in with about those things? There are different apps that you can, like mood apps, where you can journal or you can kind of keep track of your mood. There are all kinds of resources. So I think that's a good idea, and to check in with each other. I think right now we need to be naming it, expressing it, and adjusting our expectations. In terms of other daily practices, I mean, I think, I named this as trauma. And in trauma healing, it's always the opposite of the trauma experience. So you were trying to restore power, restore help, restore what has been lost. And so creating schedules, I mean, waking up at like maybe the same time, getting our body in some kind of a rhythm, taking showers, even though we're not leaving the house, getting dressed, even if we're not leaving the house. Some of those things can be so good for us mentally and emotionally. And I would just also add to not underestimate the power of scripture and music. I discovered an app during the last few weeks through a friend called Lectio 365. And it's basically like a scripture meditation, kind of walking you through scripture slowly, and one for every day, where I just, start my day sometimes just listening to scripture, even rather than reading it. So it's kind of just getting infused in my mind. Same with music. Any kind of music, whether it's Christian or not, can just distract our minds, uplift our spirit. There's something about what it does, even physiologically, that can be good for us. So exposing ourselves to rhythm and routine, scripture or music that's filling our minds with beautiful, true things. Some kind of movement, physical movement, and some kind of personal or relational check-in.
That's really good. That was another thing that I had taken from your article, the idea of the opposite, where if you're feeling like things are unpredictable, I think what you had mentioned in the article is make your life predictable.
Yes, find
the alarm
something you
clock.
can manage. And there's not a lot necessarily that we can manage, but we can be creative with that. And it's amazing what that can do mentally, emotionally, and relationally, and finding things that are within our power, within our manageability.
I love that. I love that. Speaking to those who themselves may not be wrestling with anxiety, but may have a loved one who is really struggling. What is some advice of how we can care? I know you had mentioned some of it in regards to children. Does it change when we're caring for an adult, as far as naming it and walking through? But how can we care for those we love?
Yeah, I think this is a good question. It's a really hard one in that we're all kind of at times, I think, ebbing and flowing with our tolerance and our patience right now. So we don't always have patience, but for someone who's anxious, they absolutely need patience on the other side of that. So think about what we described as happening physiologically. A person is aroused. So let's say a person just had a car accident. Like, that's not the time that we're going to be telling them, well, you should just calm down, or maybe you should just trust God more. Like, that's not going to be helpful. Yeah. Or let's say right now we're trying to have a conversation and the fire alarm is going off, and you're like, just stop being anxious. That's not going to help. Or let's say you're trying to have this really philosophical conversation with the fire alarm. It's not going to help. First and foremost, what does that person need to turn down the alarm? And so it might even be on a practical level. They need a nap before you can talk through what they're anxious about. Maybe take a walk or listen to music. Like, what can kind of help calm the body down physiologically, and how can we help with that? Now, it's tricky because we can't pull someone out of anxiety. We can't fix it. But I would say someone who's anxious needs gentleness, patience, and truth. But be gentle with the person and firm with the truth. So gentleness in terms of coming alongside them and what are you worried about? What's the hardest part of that? What are you thinking is going to happen? Maybe help them think about focusing on what's true, helpful, and productive. What can we do? What can't we do? Helping to sort out what we can do and what we can't do. Can I pray with you about this? Asking a few questions that might draw it out and help them to name it. Validate. This must be so hard. Yeah, I know this is really hard. You're doing great right now. You've been holding together so much. Validation is huge. It is not the time for lectures, and it's not the time for just pummeling them with truth. They won't hear that. They need gentleness. They do need truth, but in a way they can receive it. Their body will need to calm down in order to be able to receive that.
Wow, that's powerful. I love that. Gentle with the person, firm with the truth. It makes so much sense. So, well, we're getting closer to 8 o'clock where we're going to start to field some of the questions. So if you haven't yet, make sure you drop those questions in the chat, and we're going to get to them in just a moment. But as we transition into that, bringing it back to families, the family dynamic right now with kids maybe being home, parents working from home. What are some practical steps that our families can take, whether it's just spouses together who may be used to taking, 8 hours apart for work and then coming back, but are now living in the same place, working in the same place, parenting in the house. What can marriages and spouses do in this time to stay healthy?
I would say adjust expectations, not just of each other, but of ourselves. I think that is one thing I've noticed a lot, is just people really comparing themselves to others and ending up feeling a lot of shame, a lot of pressure, a lot of guilt put on themselves for what they are or are not doing. So adjusting expectations, communicating. What are your needs today? How can I support those needs? Figuring out a system for, when I'm about ready to check out, how can I give you a signal that you can come alongside and support me? I would say taking walks. You can get out, you can get fresh air, you're walking alongside together and sharing. Being creative and how to honor space and privacy for everyone, and being able to name what I need and being able to ask each other, what do you need? It's just, it's unprecedented with the amount of space that's being shared. And I will say I've heard really beautiful stories of families that are enjoying the slower pace, that are enjoying the time together, that are finding creative ways to spend time together. And so I think for many, this can be a time of really sweet memories and sweet shared times of communication. For others, they're saying, yeah, right, I'm just trying to get by. For others, this has actually been a time of heightened stress and even heightened danger. And so we also have to be really aware and sensitive of how everyone's experiences are so different during this time.
So good. I love that. Love that. Well, we're gonna take some questions now. So as you have questions, make sure you're dropping them in the chat. We've had some that were messaged to us earlier in the day,
Okay.
and the first question is, as they come in, was about kids, and you had mentioned about naming it in kids when you see it, but this question is more about how do you recognize it in them? Like, how do you differentiate acting out or anxious? How do you differentiate?
Well, I would say noticing changes in a child's behavior patterns. So if they're responding differently to something, then they might not, if they're responding differently to a situation, then I would be curious about that. And is this perhaps related to something they're fearful of, or a lack of structure and a lack of routine? Something is off and making it unmanageable. So I would, everyone knows their children, how they might typically respond. And so if something seems a little bit off, I would notice that. So other than that, I think that's a challenging question, but I think over time and over conversation, you want to manage the behavior, of course, especially if it's out of control, but you want to help the child understand and themselves, what was going on? What were you thinking and feeling? What else was going on? As you kind of engage with that child, you might be able to have signs that there's something more going on than just I was acting out. I'm afraid. I'm sad. And kids aren't always able to articulate those things, but I think through conversation, you might be able to understand a little bit more where it might be coming from.
That's great. That's great. The second question that came in is talking about post-pandemic. How do we make sure that we're not carrying the fear and the habits that we may be getting in pandemic? How do we not carry that out post-pandemic?
That's a good question. I've really been asking this a lot and trying to project what is post-pandemic life actually going to look like? What will be, how long will it take? And I think, again, this idea is how do we be responsible and cautious, yet not fearful and paranoid? And I think we also have to acknowledge that's going to look different for each one of us. We need to show respect and grace for those differences versus judgment of what someone is doing or not doing. All of that creates disconnection, which is not what we need. What we need post-pandemic is connection with each other. And it's for this to have changed us, to move us to a greater place of growth as a society, as individuals, as families, as church communities. How can we come out of this in a place of growth? So while I don't know specifically, I would say each of us has to know, what decisions am I making that are actually, like, what's governing me right now? Is this just being responsible, being wise and cautious, or am I afraid? If I'm afraid, I probably need to manage how I'm doing this so that fear is not governing me, whatever that might look like. I mean, again, I think we're going to be given some level of kind of precautions of what behaviors we should continue and for how long. But if we are keeping ourselves in a place of alertness and alarm, that's not sustainable and that's not healthy. We'll be making decisions out of fear governing us, rather than kindness, rather than responsibility and wisdom.
Wow, that's great. It brings it back to what you said in the beginning about Philippians 4 and watching our what we're focusing on and our thoughts and how we're framing everything. So that's great. That's great. We have more questions coming in. Someone was asking, how do we know if a stress mechanism is not healthy?
Wow. Um, First of all, our mechanisms, we ask ourselves, is this dangerous to myself or another person? Is this legal or illegal? Is this in any way compromising my faith, my standards, my value systems? Is this controlling me? Is this governing me? Am I making this decision? Now, we might be motivated to do something to escape, and it's actually what we need to kind of free our minds. But what am I escaping from? So I think it's our motivation. It is whether or not it is harmful to myself or another, relationally or physically or emotionally. And it's looking at the pattern of it. Is it something that actually has started to manage me and control me rather than me doing this for my health and my benefit?
Oh, that's really good. I love that. We have more questions coming in. I'm gonna try to go through as many as we can. Someone was asking, this is more of a faith-based question, and I know we have people joining us who are just here for the anxiety information, but from a Christian perspective, how do we not carry the guilt from, well, we know we're supposed to trust in God, and yet I feel fearful and I feel anxious. I mean, how do you balance the two without falling into the guilt of like, I should be trusting God, but I can't right now, or I feel like I can't right now?
Mm-hmm. First of all, I think there's so much in scripture about not being afraid and not being anxious because it's a human condition. And we are prone to anxiety and fear. It's not unfamiliar to God. He expects it. Second of all, I would say that an anxiety disorder is a physiological condition. It is a condition of the brokenness of our bodies. And it would be like feeling guilty for having diabetes or cancer. And it's a little bit more tricky because it feels more sinful, like it's an act of sin, but it's actually a condition of the body, that there is a disproportionate amount of stress and anxiety going on. And so for a person to feel guilty about that is unnecessary guilt. It's just, we can grieve over the brokenness of our bodies and how it affects us from having a peaceful life.
Right.
But the final thing that I will say is that, I mean, I don't know if others can relate to this. And I think in our fear and anxiety, it's where we meet God in our brokenness. I mean, I think we need things like global pandemics to come to our knees in a new, more dependent, broken, humbled way. And we're afraid. And there is a beauty in the brokenness of our fear that draws us to the Lord, that I don't know on this earth will we ever be absent of fear and anxiety. I don't think we will. But the question is, are we drawing near to the Lord in the midst of that fear and anxiety? And I believe we could be closer to the Lord than ever and still be experiencing fear, because our fear is either a condition of our brokenness or it's a real fear about a legitimate issue that we have.
Yeah.
So again, turning that guilt into just drawing near to the Lord and not putting the pressure on ourselves that we have to eliminate ourselves from that fear and that anxiety, but instead being with the Lord in the midst of it.
That's great. I think that idea of guilt brings us back to the idea of naming it. I just wonder how many of us know, well, the Bible says, be anxious for nothing, but I feel anxious, so I'm going to try to avoid it. And we refuse to name it. And when we refuse to name it, we can't address it. And we just kind of stay in it.
Yes.
But getting past that idea of guilt, that no, it doesn't mean there's something we mentioned on Sundays. It doesn't mean there's something wrong with me. It just means that there's an opportunity for me to grow and to press into God and to find peace in the midst of all of this that we have. But getting past the guilt and being able to name it. And I just think that there's sometimes in the Christian circles almost a stigma around seeking professional help. And that's one of the battles that we've kind of been facing in this series is to say, again, this is not to replace the conversations that people have with doctors like you. And so I guess a question I have is, how do those listening know, okay, it's time for me to talk to somebody?
So that's a good question. In my experience, I have a group counseling practice in the Lehigh Valley, Pennsylvania region, and people typically wait too long. They want to just try to push through. They wait till crisis mode, and then they call a counseling center, and we have a waiting list. And I would say it can be hard. It can take multiple calls to find a good counselor that's a good fit for you, that may take your insurance or is a payment that works for you. And many places have waiting lists. And so I would say not to wait too long. I would rather someone say, as soon as they're curious about, might this benefit me, to give a call and give it a try for 3 sessions. Have a Q&A with the counselor on the phone and see what you think. I would just say not wait too long. But to get back to your question, I think you're looking at when there's a current feeling or experience or relational pattern where you feel stuck and you really don't know how to cope and you don't know where to turn. You've sought advice from friends and family and you still feel stuck. In terms of anxiety, you're looking at how often is this happening? How long has this been going on? How intense is it when it happens? Those kinds of things can help. But for me, I mean, I think that counseling can really help anyone. I think this current situation is a time for all of us to evaluate, to reflect, to grow. It's an opportunity for growth. And meeting with a counselor can certainly facilitate that growth process for any myriad of challenges and issues that someone might be facing.
That's really good. I think we see that too. I mean, we don't do counseling at our church, but typically seeing, having conversations with a marriage and we wait until there's a visible brokenness before we seek it. And it's almost like the best time to seek help is almost when you're healthy enough to be able to work through what you're going through. And for those who are watching and you are wrestling with anxiety and you've been battling, I don't feel like I should feel this way and therefore I want to avoid it. And we want to encourage you, have the courage to name it, surround yourself with a community that is going to support you and not condemn you, and open it, bring it out into a safe, open place, and seek the help that you need. And that's where the healing begins to happen. I love that. Well, I want to honor your time. We're at the 8:15 mark, but is there anything else that you wanted to add to the conversation?
Yes, if you do read the article I wrote, that it's kind of long, but it was like the dumping out of all of my reflections and thoughts at the beginning of, well, I don't remember if it was at the beginning, this has been a blur. But there's one part at the end that I talk about a concept of post-traumatic growth, and I'd like to leave on that note. So post-traumatic growth is a theory from these two guys, Tedeschi and Calhoun. And basically it's this idea that when someone has experienced trauma, that when they get through the trauma, they will not only bounce back, which is the idea of resilience, to where they were before the point of trauma, but they will grow beyond where they were before the point of trauma. And the areas where a person will grow beyond the point of trauma include personal strength, new possibilities relating to others, appreciation of life, and spiritual change. I had the opportunity to study for my dissertation survivors of sex trafficking from victims from the US. And one of the things I looked at was this idea of post-traumatic growth. The data was profound in terms of the women who had experienced horrific, repeated trauma and exploitation. And the data showed post-traumatic growth.
Wow.
I believe this current circumstance is an opportunity for us as individuals, families, communities, and nations to come out of this not having bounced back, but moving to a new place that represents growth out of what we have collectively endured, evidenced in our strength, in our relationships, in spiritual change, in new possibilities and appreciation for life. You might not be there. You might be saying, I'm just trying to get by. So that's okay too. We need to just be patient and gracious to ourselves and adjust our expectations. But I do want to say this is an opportunity for growth. Pay attention to what's coming up in you during this time. How might you grow through that or from that? Pay attention to what you're appreciating about this new rhythm. How might you take that into post-pandemic life, which I do believe there will be a post-pandemic life. But I think this is just a really great opportunity. And I'm looking forward to seeing how we do grow from this experience.
Yeah, come on. I know you're going to preach at the end. But I love that. It's so good. When we started off the year, we did a series called Failure to Thrive. And we're just, preach this whole message about we're not going to survive this year. We're going to thrive in this year. And then the pandemic hits and the question is, okay, are we back to survival? And so it's so good to hear this idea of post-traumatic growth, that you can actually, the trauma can actually be an accelerator of growth. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
It's great. That's awesome. Well, we appreciate, hey, in the comments, in the hearts, in the emojis, drop them. Let Dr. Evans know how grateful we are. But we're so grateful that you would take the time to talk with us, to share your wisdom with us. We really appreciate it.
Well, it's such an honor. I think it's so timely that you had that sermon series, and it sounds like then followed up by the sermon series on fear and anxiety. Is that correct? So yeah. I think that, if there's something at work in your church community, I hope it will continue. This is a huge honor to have this conversation with all of you tonight, and I look forward to hearing what comes out of it.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Love you guys. Have a great night, and we'll see you soon.